Cześć. Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. Herzlich willkommen bei der Podiumdiskussion im Rahmen der Ausstellung Berlin Global. Bitte nicht wundern, dass wir gleich ins Polnische switchen. Dobry wieczór Państwu. Bardzo serdecznie witam wszystkich Państwa na spotkaniu i dyskusji w ramach wystawy Berlin Global. Ja nazywam się Joanna Dadej, jestem historyczką i pracownicą naukową Polskiej Akademii Nauk. I mam ogromną radość, ogromny zaszczyt poprowadzić dzisiejsze spotkanie,
worker at the Polish
które w
Institute for
tytule
Sciences,
już
and it's an honor
zadaje
to me
następujące pytanie. Czyja walka?
to moderate this session with you.
Kilka
The
uwag
title is
technicznych
important.
do naszego
Whose
spotkania. Jak
fights,
Państwo
whose
zdążyliście zauważyć,
memory?
jesteśmy w Berlinie, w forum, w budynku
As you see, we
Humboldt
are
Forum.
here in Berlin at
Nasze
the
spotkanie
Humboldt Forum.
prowadzone w języku polskim,
Our
kompletnie w języku
meeting
polskim. Tłumaczone jest
will
na język
be
angielski
led
i
in
na język
Polish
niemiecki
with
oraz
simultaneous
język niemiecki
interpretation into English,
Prosimy o wybranie
into German,
odpowiadających Państwu
and
kanałów
into
na
German
platformie
Sign
YouTube.
Language. Please
Kwestią
choose the
techniczną,
language
ale też
of your
zaproszeniem
choice
do dyskusji w
on
ramach tej naszej
YouTube, and
hybrydowej,
a technical
hybrydowego
information and
spotkania
an
jest
invitation
kwestia
to our hybrid
nastawiania przez
discussion.
Państwa obserwujących nas, uczestniczących w tym spotkaniu,
It's important
stawiania
that those
pytań, pisania
who
własnych komentarzy,
follow
czy też
our
refleksji
meeting,
za pomocą
we would like to
czatu.
invite you
Pytania,
to send us your questions
zbierzemy później pod
using the
koniec
chat
naszego
function.
spotkania i uwzględnimy je
These
oczywiście w
questions
naszej
will be
dyskusji.
collected by us
Jak się
and
Państwo
will then be
domyślacie
considered in our
z
discussion.
z obsady, czy też
As you
wybranego języka
probably already
dyskusji dzisiejszego
guessed,
spotkania, spróbujemy dzisiaj
depending on your language
do tych
combination,
globalnych wątków i refleksji
we will try
związanych z
to
wystawą Berlin Global wpleść perspektywę
look at all of the global aspects,
wpleść perspektywę nadwiślańską, polską,
and maybe from a point of
ale
view,
żeby sprawę
from a
jeszcze trochę
Polish point of
skomplikować,
view,
chciałybyśmy, żeby ta perspektywa
in order to make
polska,
things
wątki
more
polskie
complicated, we would
przedeklinowane były
like
przez płeć
to
kulturową. Przedeklinowane były przez to, o czym
make
czasami
certain
się
that's the
zapomina,
Polish
o tym, że
perspective
również
and
obywatelska
the cultural
kobiety,
gender is properly used because, of course, women are also citizens, and therefore we would like to signal that women are very present in the social and political realm in Poland in the last 40 years.
Są zarówno w Berlinie czy w Niemczech, ale i w
In
Polsce.
this November, as well in Germany as also in Poland, the very thought-provoking days. In Germany, we remember the Crystal Night, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and in Poland, the 11th November, which is Independence Day for Poland, combined with great celebrations and the regaining of Polish independence.
Święta państwowego, narodowego w Polsce chcemy się spotkać tutaj w Berlinie.
That's the state holiday, and therefore here in the Humboldt Forum we come together in order to have local, regional and state or national, but also show global ways towards independence. It's also about the way of women towards independence to self-determination, and it's about the fight for your own rights and for human rights and of rights of minorities. Independence, solidarity, these Polish export topics were often mentioned in books, in articles, and in exhibitions with regards to this topic. And many works were created that show that this heritage of solidarity, the heritage of the last 40 or 50 years in Poland. Today, we would like to show to you that this perspective is often ignored, that is looked at nonchalantly, that's not considered seriously enough. It's a perspective of women and of the female participants on those events that happened. These women participated in the resistance movement, in political movements, and we want to show their way to independence and remember their struggle. In the beginning, we would like to watch part of a movie, Solidarity According to Women. This film was presented to a German audience in 2015, Solidarity According to Women. The Marta Tido and Piotr Szybowski was translated into German and is available on the website of the BPB. So let's watch the first 5 minutes.
Das war eine Zeit unglaublicher Unsicherheit, aber auch großen Glücks. Alles war so unwirklich. Unser Ziel war die Befreiung Polens von der Sowjetunion. Freiheit, Demokratie. Viele Frauen waren in der Opposition. Sie setzten ihr ganzes Leben aufs Spiel. Und sie kämpften, um zu siegen. Wir wussten nicht, was mit uns passieren würde. Es gab sehr viele Provokationen. Die Sache war wichtiger als die Angst. Sie wissen das nicht mehr. Sie waren damals ein kleines Kind. Aber Polen war damals ganz einfach ein Albtraum. Ein Albtraum. Sie wissen das nicht mehr. Als 1980 in Polen die Streiks ausbrachen, war ich noch nicht auf der Welt. Meine Eltern haben damals geheiratet. Meine Geburt fiel in die gleiche Zeit wie die Geburt der Solidarność. In meiner Familie gab es keine Revolutionäre. Es sei denn, man nennt die Tatsache revolutionär, dass mein Vater als einer der ersten Väter in Polen Erziehungsurlaub nahm, um mich zu betreuen, bis ich in den Kindergarten kam. Meine Mutter ging arbeiten. Erst später habe ich verstanden, wie unüblich das damals war. Die Sphäre der Frauen war das Zuhause. Der öffentliche Raum gehörte den Männern. Als ich in den 1990er Jahren aufs Gymnasium ging, beschränkte sich mein Wissen über die Solidarność auf folgendes Schema. Lech Wałęsa springt über den Zaun, die Arbeiter nehmen ihn auf die Schultern, er hebt wie ein Rockstar die Hand in die Luft, macht das Victory-Zeichen. Und dann schreien alle: Die Wende 1989 ist für mich eher mit unserem ersten Videorekorder verbunden, als mit dem Sturz des Kommunismus. Sie können sich daran nicht erinnern. Sie waren damals noch ein kleines Kind. Das offizielle Narrativ über die Geschichte der Solidarność ist eine Erzählung über Männer. Vollbärtige Intellektuelle und Arbeiter mit Schnurrbart, die wie tapfere Cowboys die Freiheit erkämpfen. Der Mythos ist männlichen Geschlechts. Die Geschichte der Frauen, Aktivistinnen, Revolutionärinnen, Kämpferinnen ist irgendwo am Rande mit Bleistift geschrieben. Sie verblasst, weil sie nicht ernst genommen wird.
Alina Pieńkowska, Helena Łuczynowska, Basia
Grażynka,
Elżbieta Szczepańska,
Joanna,
Anna Walentynowicz, Alina Pieńkowska i Ewa Ostrowska, Ania Krysowa,
Basia,
Ania Dozik,
Joanna Gwiazda,
Ania Bikont,
Małgosia,
Zosia, Iwona, Marylka,
Elżbieta,
Maria,
Bożena,
Dorota,
Grażynka.
Nie znając ich historii,
Wenn ich ihre Geschichte nicht kenne, kann ich die Wirklichkeit nicht verstehen, in der ich lebe.
historia
Die Geschichte der Frauen ist überwachsen mit Unkraut und Moos.
jak ją
Wie können wir sie zurückgewinnen? Wie können wir sie erzählen? Wir waren junge, zierliche Mädchen. Wir haben sehr viel geraucht. Das war eine fantastische Zeit. Wir saßen bis spät in der Nacht an der Schreibmaschine.
Bardzo dziękuję. Proszę Państwa,
Thank you very
do naszej
much.
rozmowy
Ladies and gentlemen,
zaprosiłyśmy Martę Dzido. Jest na
our
reżyserką
conversation,
Solidarność.
we invited Marta Gido,
Dzień dobry Marto, dzień dobry do
who made
Warszawy.
the movie
Marta
The
Dzido
Solidarity According to Women. Good morning to Warsaw.
jest reżyserką dokumentalistyczną
Marta Gido is a writer, an author, and documentary filmmaker, and a close observer of the public domain in Poland. She wrote books like A Hint of Mother Matryoshka or End of Season, and as a co-author and the Tom Tom and other movies like Siwatki, The Women of the First Hour in the German translation, and together with Francisca Gonzalez in 2000 they made a movie that looks at the underground of abortions. She won a lot of awards, literary and film prizes in Poland and worldwide. I welcome you to today's conversation, and I only would like to say as much as this movie was promoted in 2015. It was presented to the German audience. One of my German friends said, who knows much about the Solidarność time because he was a sympathizer of the movement back in the day. He told me for the following sentence, the film of Marta Gido should be put next to movies of Andrzej Wajda, The Man of Iron, or Volker Schlöndorff, about the strike at the Danzig works. With your movie, you make a huge contribution to popularize the situation and about what really happened inside the Solidarność movement, what made them successful. I'd like to ask you, why did you choose this topic? What or who was an inspiration to you when it comes to your work with regards to this difficult topic? in your research looking for women who were silent heroes in the day and who are not visible? What marked your way of the Solidarność movement? The question you are asking cannot be answered in a single sentence. I have to start earlier. I took my inspiration and I talked about it in the 5 minutes that were presented to you. But the first moment when I wanted to go deeper in this topic was in 2008, when, together with Ms. Gonzalez, when I worked with her on our movie where the women who had experience of illegal abortions and who talk about this subject, and amongst others, women and activists are interviewed. And one of them told us horrible story from the early 90s, a history of a women's section within Solidarność, where the production norms were talked about. And this group of women wanted certain norms introduced, and for their advocacy of a change of norms, they were dissolved. And that was disturbing to me. And then I wondered, how is that possible that in a democratic country at the beginning of the 90s, women were treated, that their voices were taken away in questions that are relevant to them? And the second question was, what was life like as a woman in the Solidarność movement, in that citizens movement? What did they do then? It seemed to me that as an educated person with a university degree, I should know about it. But that proved to me that I only know about Wałęsa, his jump over the wall, and nothing more. And then I looked at how this history was told and what do we know about it. I looked at photos from that period, the discussions on the round table were presented. On the photos, you see this huge table. There's all men, there's only men, and there's one huge point, that's Miss Staniszewska, the only woman that was represented there in the plenary meeting and who was invited there. It's a series of astounding moments. And then I looked at the revolt of the Danzig works that started the entire movement, that later continued throughout Europe. And I discovered a second surprising story, a story about a flag, about a banner on the wall of the Danzig works, and it read, "Women, leave us alone, we fight for Poland." I looked again at those photographs, and I looked at the many documentary photos, and I asked people who knew the time then, and asked people who were there whether this banner was there. And it led me to Berlin, where women like Eva Maria Slaska and Maria Daszczyhomska, who had participated in the day in those events at the Danzig works. And They remembered the women, and I asked them, how was it possible that such a thing happened? Was it indeed that these women disturbed the men and that they should go away and not disturb them? And it was really astonishment. And then the idea of the film was born. We worked for 4 years on this movie, and many points were unclear, things that could not be cleared up, elements and situations. We had several periods in history that no one had talked about before. We asked some female participants that were member of the strike that are unknown to the public at large, who had greatly contributed to what happened then. A woman who had accompanied Valenza, her name was sometimes mentioned, but she was never invited to certain celebrations that happened every year, which was unclear to us. So we continued our research and we found that we succeeded in a way to show a story that's not bent. Thank you very much. It's a story about pain, of remembering things that are forgotten. It's difficult to find the right words, because there is repressed stories. It's an attempt to show this story, to tell the large story, but also show the small parts of the story, those aspects who are less visible, and paint a picture that is universal. Before that happens, I'd like to look at the phenomenon Solidarność. What role did the women play? The participants, who were about half of the 10 million movement. Before asking you for the role of women and their ways and their tasks that resulted from the distribution of work between men and women, before looking at their ways, I'd like to focus on looking at the introduction. You said in the introduction of the movie that it's a condensed version. It's the clue of our conversation about the forgetting. Can we play the movie trailer? There were many women in opposition. They threw their life into the lot. They had a perspective of liberating Poland from the Soviet Union. I knew I was afraid that this thing was larger than our fear. And so Solidarność was born. Back in the day, it did not have a name, this movement. It was only names: Anna Valentinowicz, Anno Chivo, Barbara Labuda, and Eva Ossowska. And those, Alba was a woman here, Mrs. Ossowska, a very slender, small woman who really embodied a lot of power. Can you remember how the strike started in August There was a woman because of the strike, Eva Ossowska. There were so many here. You cannot tell this any longer. You have to really live it. Let's do everything so we can talk to the people in power. Even though yesterday 3 horrible things happened, we were successful. Behind us is the institution of the round table.
Dziękuję bardzo. Marto, no właśnie.
Thank you very much for that. Could you please tell me, maybe by using a specific example of specific people, what kind of roles these women and girls played in these structures? And also, what kind of role was assigned to them and where were they from? So what kind of social circles were they from? And what kind of education or training did they go through? Maybe you could just describe that. Describe specific examples back then and then also during the transformation and after the transformation. So it's really about their life in the 80s. This question is very difficult to answer because it's so many, and they really came from very different social circles. They had very different levels of education, different experiences, and also their age differed greatly. However, I do think that the fact that they were mostly charismatic women is something that they had in common. It was women with lots of potential. They were born leaders. What I have noticed when I looked at the archives was that even in the films, we're able to see that it wasn't women who just cooked some tea and made dinner and just copied others. But instead, they actually could speak to the masses. What I've heard from the year 1981, when a woman was traveling through Poland, I was really surprised to hear that a woman who actually only went to elementary school, managed to not read off a paper, but speak beautifully. And she was very charismatic and had the great potential to explain things to people. To me, that was one of the big miracles. It's still a miracle today. It is really amazing to see so many strong women with visions, with strategies, and making it where these people, when this movement started, it wasn't a movement where everybody contributed, and it turned into this hierarchical movement where people had specific functions that they fulfilled. So there were sort of leaders and representatives, etc. And all of a sudden, it became clear that men took on positions, certain positions, and women still did the same thing. They risked a lot because that was the time where doing this type of job was very much tied to being imprisoned, losing your job. Children were threatened. as well as family members. So they lived a life of fear. And when we shot this movie and when we started our conversations, these women told us that it wasn't anything big. It was their duty to do that. But to me, it was something unbelievable. It was a huge risk they took. And I have to say that I wondered myself, if I was in their position, would I have decided to do it or not? Because these girls and women were aged between 20 to 30 years old. They had small children and they really risked a lot. And Eva Orlowska is one of the women that sort of saved everything. She was 19 at this time. She had a 1-year-old son back then. She was the neighbor to Lech Morenza. And in this way, that's how she got into that position. And she really saved that strike. She was part of the group of women who really said, Lech Morenza, no, after 3 days, we don't want to continue the strike, or we don't want to finish the strike. We want to continue with the strike. So it wasn't about salary increases, but it was more than that. That was the main argument. They said that they wanted to take advantage of the situation so it would never repeat itself again. And that was a decision made by very few women, courageous women, Eva Orlowska, who actually started speaking to everyone and explaining what the situation is like and why it's worth staying there and still being on strike and protesting. However, there were many women there, many women. They were very much engaged. They organized everything and they spoke to people and they had the potential to become leaders. And they didn't do it at the end of the day. On top of that, they also sort of laid the groundwork while men were arrested. There were many women who were able to avoid being arrested. They printed sheets, distributed them, smuggled them. They actually went to illegal radio stations, published their programs, and there's even a great story that wasn't part of the film, but part of this book. And I'm going to show you that now. So it's sort of an addition to the narrative of the movie. And there is a story of a woman who managed to produce a show on the radio that was then available in prisons. So she made it where prison inmates could listen to this radio station, and that gave the inmates hope. On top of that, many women were arrested as well. Some were tortured, and they didn't see an option to exist anymore, and they decided to leave the country. Thank you very much. That really shows very well that our main question is very important, which is, who does this fight belong to? And who owns the memory of it? And the narrative of the struggle in this fight. You show that very well in this movie. You really show what it felt like for the society and being responsible. And that's a feeling that these women shared. It was a movement of resistance, of opposition, of protest. And this movement was very much anchored in Polish tradition of independence struggles, and it was also supported by structures of the church. So it's been an oppositional movement. However, your story of women that showed solidarity is just one of the stories about our traditional Poland and the shift in our society that just wanted to be a civil society. And I think that apart from showing solidarity in this mass movement, it also makes sense to look at different initiatives and movements and mention them today, because they were still part of the socialist Poland, right? That was not free. And their beginnings are specifically in that time. So I think the moment in time has come to move on to the next participant. So Jennifer, thank you so, so much for being here. Please stay here. And ladies and gentlemen, I would now like to introduce the next speaker. The next speaker is going to tell us more about what we've just heard. The phenomenon of the movement in the 80s and the opposition of women in the 90s is a picture that others are focusing on as well. So you are here. She's a researcher at Vitrine. She works at Frankfurt an der Oder. On top of that, she also researches the history of the 80s in Europe. She's also very much interested in nationalist movements in Europe and Poland, and the transformation and gender in the 90s. She's a great researcher and scientist, and also she documents these times very well. She tries to really keep the memory of these movements that was very, very prominent in the public sector, not only women movements, but also LGBTQ movements. And in order for those groups to be heard, that is very important. Her work is based on interviews. She also founded an archive for social injustice. She also likes to take pictures. She loves photography, and she shows young people how to participate in protests, how you can organize them. And she makes that into art. Jenny, could you show us what the society in the 80s was like, how it was set up, and how people tried to find their own way in this starting capitalist country? Where was room for women? What were their rights? And how was this narrative about the future implemented? Jennifer. Yeah, thank you very much. I would like to talk about how the democracy started. Very often that is forgotten about, and it also has something to do with solidarity. It's closely connected to it, indeed. There are two publications that date back to these times. The first one is Kino Kobiet, and the second one is a magazine that was published in the 90s. And these covers show a problem that this movement of women was confronted with. There's lots of Catholic aspects included, and also no women being represented in politics. That is something we've already heard about today. And that is also something that you saw in culture in general. And this cover, the women's cinema, das Kino der Frauen, is very interesting. It's the women's cinema. This is sort of a type of pair of glasses. It's a cover from the 80s. And it's very hard to imagine today what the world was like back then. A world in which women had to function. Women's cinema was a film festival organized by a young group of students, female students, who founded their group in the 1970s. And they were not part of this solidarity movement. They were students, female students, who met at the university in Warsaw. And they read feminist literature. They were very much interested in it. And that was the first attempt to sort of push all of that in the public space. And that's how these debates started, basically. They also gave some interviews, which was very important. On top of that, they tried to find the right language to talk about their own experiences and how women should be respected. There was attempts to create some awareness. And the person that organized this festival had to get support from other women, because otherwise it'd be very difficult. It'd be difficult to get support by the government or the state. So the group that organized this festival founded or registered one of the first non-governmental organizations in Poland. Now I'm going to talk about the second cover. So that is a magazine cover that was in 1990. So that was actually released right before the section was no longer there. Even though there were lots of women in solidarity, there was no specific section for women. And this topic was sort of lost at a point. And that is something that became visible, specifically in other countries as well. And then they decided that it'd be important to found this section. It was found in February of 1990. And this person was very important in this section, also very important person when it comes to the feminist movement of the 90s. Małgorzata. It's important to know that there were different movements. So she participated in the movement Freedom and Peace. Of course, this movement was also influenced by feminists, but it also had something to do with the freedom movements of the 80s. So they founded this section and they had their own postulates, and I would like to read that. First point, more women in leadership positions of trade units, more than 50% access to cheap childcare, same salary for the same work, less discrimination at work, and laws that punish women should be stopped, for example, against abortion. So that's when it first came up that abortion should not be punishable anymore. And the last motto, at the time of Marianne Czartoryski, they decided that this section should be dissolved. And in the Senate,
Krajowa Solidarności. I to była właśnie konieczna.
And they said that this women's section is not agreeing with this wording. That was a big shock for the women's section.
To może też jest trochę jakby jak patrzymy na historię NRD, widzimy, że działy się troszeczkę podobne.
So if we look at the German's history, it's very similar. We also talked about that. We're here at the Humboldt Forum, and there was the Palace of the Republic. All of that is connected to socialism. So we think that we can get rid of it. And in Germany, at that time, the right for abortion was also very, very strict. And the same held true for Poland. Everybody thought that anything that has to do with Poland was just outdated. The difference was that in GDR, things happened and changed very quickly. In Poland, it took very, very long. And it just didn't run as smoothly as it did in Germany. It's very important to be aware of that. And the Catholic circles, for them, it meant getting back to the past. Talking about national democratic movement. And this is sort of like a struggle that we have to see in this context, or this fight. Those were the first attempts that already started in the 80s. And all of that was looked at equally as the oppressive system. And it's also very important to say that the feminist women that founded the women's section were called feminists. And the abortion law was only changed way later. So after 57, it was a very, very strange situation women were in. Women were in a difficult situation. On the one hand, there was communism. On the other hand, they couldn't found their own groups. That was forbidden as well. And when the fight for women's rights started, they were in a very, very dire situation. It was very difficult. And the Women's League supported them. However, it wasn't easy. It just got more and more complicated with time. I would like to show you a photo, my process from the 90s that was organized by a Polish organization that was also typed with a typewriter as well. And you can also see the posters with the slogans, "No solidarity without freedom for women." So you can see that this transformation is very much one-sided, and it's also about democratization of genders. So now I'm going to move on to the next picture, a second photo from an earlier protest that's under Copernicus. That was in 1989. And this protest was initiated by female students. And this movement was against criminalizing abortions. And you just have to be aware that these attempts were a very long process. Feminists organized protests like that even in the 80s, and different people were mobilized and joined in. So it wasn't only about women, but it was also about the direction Poland was supposed to go in. So it also included women from different circles who were in favor of this referendum. There was an initiative. So it was really a mix of different women. And yeah, I would like to tell you more about the forgotten story of the 90s and what happened during that time. So what happened was that there were lots of conferences. Women networked, talked to each other. They talked about many different topics, but some were still excluded, like topics that were never discussed. For example, violence against women. So there was this women's movement that kind of started. We can see some pictures from these conferences that was initiated by the women's organization in Poland, but in Posen, Breslau, and Krakow, they also have a women's association. And they're very, very important because they sort of formed the basis for this feminist movement. And if we look at these pictures, we see lots of people and names that we are still familiar with today. Izabela Jorga-Nowacka, who actually passed away in the flight catastrophe. So we can just see women who organize these referendums, and we can see some continuity in here, which is very nice. However, cross-generational discussions are missing. The awareness is missing for that. So we can see two parts of forgetting. First and foremost, it's about the process of democratization and collectively remembering it. And of course, that creates new movements. So in the 90s, it was mainly the woman's perspective and the woman's perspective being perceived by others. It was mainly about things like ownership of women, but the legal framework was missing. Rape was also a big topic. That was very much a taboo topic before then, and they picked it up again. Many of these people have founded different organizations, and they definitely worked on it for a long time. There were lots of changes introduced. Maybe we're not even aware of all of them. However, a lot has changed in many regards. Other than those reproductive rights, even though a lot has changed there as well when it comes to in vitro, for example, or access to contraception, and then also abortion laws have changed, etc. So I mainly feel like non-governmental influences were quite big. Marta Chito also mentioned that many of them weren't part of politics, and the same holds true for the women's movement. There was some kind of aversion. They didn't want to be in politics. Some of these women say that they regret not being part of politics. Back then, they had different goals in mind. They wanted to create non-hierarchical structures. And in the area where they were active, they actually accomplished a lot. So if we look back at these times, the 90s, I showed covers. And you can't say that women weren't present in culture. They had a very strong voice in culture. And I think a lot has happened in terms of mentality. And today it's really just about changing politics, changing laws on a social level. Yeah, and with that, this is the end of my presentation. There's just one more remark I'd like to make. One more remark that's quite interesting. In these interviews, the interviews that I conducted with these interviews and girls from the Polish Feminist Association, they told me that they're sad. They are sad because they think that they were excluded from Polish history. People say that their story isn't true. And we also talked about capitalism. And these women sometimes feel that they're just one big group, even though this feminist movement is still very much progressive. We don't look back. And to me, that was very important to mention. It was important for me to give them a voice, but it wasn't the only movement. There were also lots of women who were just out in the streets protesting.
Thank you very much, Jenny. What you talk and Marta talked about, it's a brutal truth that the gaining of democracy, it was a violent path. And on this path, people were and rights were forgotten. They were attacked, and human rights were violated of female citizens. But nonetheless, they found a way to social transformation, as Marta said. about the time of Solidarność. You talked about the phase of transition, about the construction of the new Poland, the new homeland, not looking back. All that is to do with the Republic of Poland is dark time. I remember the slogan you talked about, democracy without women is only half democracy. It's one of the known slogans from the 90s.
dążenia do społeczeństwa obywatelskiego. Ale ponieważ jesteśmy w Berlinie, Jeni, i ponieważ czas nas goni i bardzo chciałam cię prosić o jedno krótkie...
But we are in Berlin and we do not have a lot of time. Therefore, one quick question. We are in Berlin and we try to understand the global and transnational context and show this. Can you tell us, at the time that's interesting to you, the 80s and 90s, how was our contacts of women? How did they communicate with people abroad, with the German associations of Unified Germany, or in the early 80s? We know that Rutka Welka-Lajzerowicz was very active. She studied and had contact to Solidarność, and she was repressed in the GDR. There were many people in the opposition, Women for Peace, for example. And there were problems because no contact could be established. And in the late 80s, when many women went to and emigrated to West Berlin, how was this in the 90s? With business transfer, with contacts, aid. Can you give us an idea? That's also a multidimensional topic. Emigration on the one hand of many people who emigrated from Poland to Germany. One important person was Partum, a female artist who in the 70s had many performances. And she had contacts with Polish feminists. It was the time of transformation. At that point in time, many Polish descendants wanted to go back to Poland to help with the transition. So there was a lot of exchange of ideas here. There was good networking. The network of East-West women, for example, founded by a person in contact with American associations. And the war in Yugoslavia was reacted. And this was a concept of feminism across borders, to establish contact across borders, even though there was war on various levels. With regards to Germany, contacts were strong and close, and the Women's Foundation helped them financially. They were later associated with the Green Party in Germany, the Zentrum der Frauen in Poland, and FK in Krakow were also supported. And these foundations had a lot of contact with Berlin. You know, people in this network. So contacts are very close. There were contacts between women from the former GDR, for example, to give a few examples. So this was the tradition. And it continued. Exactly. With your narrative, you show a path to the future, and I would like to introduce another conversation partner, Anna Krenz, with her experience on immigration, her transnational existence between two or three countries in the context not just of Polish networks who look at protests, but in the context of global networks, of global forms of protest. I'll ask Ms. Grenzt, she's artist, she is activist and writer, as an artist and an architect. In her art and her stories about the political situation, and in her pieces of art, she looks at the social reality that are connected to the environment, but also with irony and humor. In her pieces and in her work, she gives things a form. These are drawings, photos, and performances. She immortalizes what happens now, the present protests, what happened literally yesterday in her works of art. She reflects on the politics in Poland and here. She's a speaker of the Berlin section of the informal group of activists Mädels für die Mädels, Women for Women. She organizes demonstrations. We started with Solidarność, then we talked about the civic society of the 90s, and now we would like to look at the 2000s and later. And our idea and intention is to show the struggle for women's rights, for fundamental rights that happen now. And this struggle takes place now. And it's not just what happened in 2016, but not just in today's context with the powers that be now, but this was resulting from the decades past, how women's rights were treated by politics. And here we could observe that conservative and church circles associated together to fight women's rights, to re-traditionalize the society in Poland. Anna is known, Girls for Girls are known, they search the public space in order to perform and shine a light on the situation of women in Poland, not just what is considered rollback, but it's a global wave that is happening. It's also to do with what happens in many countries with regards to women's, where retraditionalization is rampant. Can you give us an overview over the informal group, and can you tell us how this is in the context of a global society and the civic society at large? Thank you very much. Good evening. Indeed, in Berlin, lots of things are going on, and we as an informal group, we have been since the 2nd April 2016, we have been working. In 2015, when the conservative piece won the elections, hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets. So emotions rose up, not just in Berlin, but everywhere where Polish people live. It was a protest in all of Poland. It's nothing new, it's known in history. It's maybe different today because today we have social media, which has advantages and disadvantages. But one of the advantages is that for those people, nothing exists what happened before Facebook. So you talked a lot about the 90s, because the history of women from those years is also forgotten by us. So it's very important that we remember the 80s, the 90s. It's not that long ago, and we are a continuation of that, what happened then. And we are not exceptional. We're not the first ones, nor the most important ones, but we continue the struggle. And the brown wave you mentioned is now rolling over Europe and the world. Something radicalizes along these borders. It becomes radically more conservative. We'll talk about Mädels for Mädels, Girls for Girls. In 2016, we were founded. On Facebook, this group came together. We now call ourselves Mädels in Berlin, but Mädels for Mädels, Girls for Girls was created in the social media then, and everyone was allowed to join. And within 3 days, 100,000 people joined. Many ideas came up. The government threatened by making work laws worse, and we created a local group, Mädels Berlin, Girls Berlin, in order to organize a demonstration in Berlin. Our first large protest was the Black Monday protest. In other words, of all Polish women workers. On the 3rd of October 2016, this resulted from the rage of women because of a marathon of various demonstrations in Poland, in Warsaw, and it was an act of solidarity with these women. And I have to say, how did that happen? In the parliament, 2 laws were introduced. One draft should liberalize a law, and the other one should. It was basically pro and anti-choice, and it was a very difficult situation about abortion. And the liberal draft was simply ignored, and the conservative draft then was chosen as the standard text to be continue to work on it. And it came worse. And you can see it in this photo, the 3rd October 2016, the Black Monday, the Black protest in Berlin. I remember, spontaneously at the Warsaw Bridge, we organized this protest, and it all happened on those stairs. We would have never imagined that so many people would join us. And so we had to find the place large enough. I know these steps quite well. It's close to where I live. And it was an excellent theater for such a protest, because for us, protests are stage performances. We offer emotions, and here we had a stage, a theater, and the cinematography. The steps were part of that. We had a scenario, and we had the actors and actresses and the audience. So it was an event. It was the first huge protest of Polish women for women's rights, and therefore we remember it. One of our group, somewhat later, we fought that battle and we won. The draft was rescinded. So a battle was won, but the war was not. So the strike is a concrete organization now. So it has a formal structure now. But we live in Berlin, and our hearts beat for Poland. We are solidary with Poland, and somehow we have to keep the emotional bond with Poland. And when it comes to abortion, the German law affects us, also migrant Polish people, and therefore we want legal options for abortion in Germany because it's not wonderful in Germany either. There are paragraphs in the penal code. It's considered like a criminal case unless 3 conditions are met. So this is a performance. We cooperate with the group with the Federation for Sexual Self-Determination and 2219A, that this paragraph is removed from the German law. We hope we will be successful, so the element of solidarity is very important. But solidarity, we want it to be a two-way road, not unidirectional. We want cooperation and not just a one-way road. And we want to fight for a better future. And therefore, we want to fight together. When it comes to unity, I'd like to talk. This year is marked by diversity, but in feminist circles, we're not a unity. There are segments that no longer cooperate with each other, and that weakens our ability to work. They are excellent and colorful and varied circles, and together we have a voice, but we rarely hear this voice in unison. We see it on the 8th of March. At least this one day, we can show the world that we stand together and we speak with one voice. But in Berlin, that's extremely difficult. In 2019, that was very difficult when I went to a feminist workers' strike, and I proposed 2 actions, one of which was geared towards unification. On this one day, a unified effort, 1 minute of crying out. So 3 names on these 2 protests should happen at the same time in different places, that we symbolically do this cry out together. And both organizations agreed, and this outcry echoed from various places in the city. It is important because it's not just gives us oxygen, but each of us has a reason to cry out, and it's our common voice. This worked well, and I'm glad it did. And we wanted to export this to Poland. And I'm also happy that Poland accepted it from Germany. And this action was supposed to create a unity between us. I'd like to talk about the methods. We have artist methods, work with paintbrush and with a pen. For me, a picture speaks 1,000 words. It's often that a picture can convey more information and that on performance than you could say with words. And it's difficult to communicate, and a picture has the advantage that it makes communication possible. I have a few materials here that I use all the time. Those are female materials. It's like lines. It's something homely. And in the protests that focus on intimate matters, our bodies, using such means is something that symbolizes our intimacy and our embodiedness. And so the lace and the blinds, those are details to obscure view. It's maybe covers something private, but when you see through it, you see the world differently. And art wants you to look at the world differently. We have an opportunity to look at it as from a different perspective. On the slide, you see the logo as well. It's a embassy of female Polish people. It has two meanings, like a message and, of course, embassy as a political representation. And that's important to us because this is dominated by places dominated by parties, and it's close to us citizens. So when the Polish embassy is not there for everyone, then we have to fight back and win this space back or create an own space. And so this was a symbolic actions to found the embassy of female Polish people. And we use these symbols. It's a day of safe abortions. Here too, we have a majestic outcry in front of the Brandenburg Gate. Those were strong moments, not just in Poland, strong message, not just for Poland, but to other places as well. In last autumn, the days were difficult. In October 2020, the Constitutional Court decided that abortion with in cases of worrisome deformities of the fetus is illegal. So, therefore, a lot of legal cases became illegal. And the Constitutional Court is highly politicized in Poland. And Julia Przyremska is the president, and she's the wife of the ambassador to Germany. And last year, in Polish circles, the topic was hot, and we called each other because we couldn't. We called the action week the bloody week, but the bloody week, it were 9 bloody weeks, because every week there was a demonstration, a walk to the embassy or to the house of Julia Przyremska. So it was a festival of emancipation. And there was the Art Week in Berlin, and together with that was the Bloody Week. So there were various forms of activism. Everyone could find something to participate in, and various areas were depicted. Also, because of the protests last year, we were at several places in Berlin. We didn't want to occupy a space, but we wanted to win it back for certain contents. We wanted to create space, win back a symbolic place in a new and establish a new context. We wanted to contextualize this new, because it's usually the history is written by men, by the victors, but we show a different history. I look back to the 80s and the 90s and 100 years back. And these places that we occupied, that we won back, that was the Warsaw Bridge, the place in front of the Polish Institute, and the Brandenburg Gate, and the monument in this picture. It's called the Polish soldier and the German fascist. So there were two heroes of this. It's a peculiar site. Were there no female warriors? Was there no resistant women? So women are excluded from history. We wanted to remind their existence. We wanted to not just give this place a new name, but also a new context. A history and her story. We changed it for everyone, for all those who fought for our freedom. And this includes LGBT, who were forgotten because history is written by the victors. We wanted to enter the debate that's led in Berlin to the topic of memory, places of remembrance. Remember the victims of Nazi Germany in Poland. And we wanted to participate in this dialogue. This is our artistic contribution to this dialogue. I hope you can see the picture. On the photo, you see, amongst other things, what 1 year ago, on the 11th of November, we'd organized. That was a performance. It's a celebration of death on the basis of Alan Mickiewicz, a poem. We prepared it quickly, and from this poem, we took various excerpts, and in the celebration of the dead, we compiled a performance where we called 3 spirits. We called it one witch, then Rosa Luxemburg, and Maria Janio. Those 3 are together with us in Berlin and shall remind us and help us fight, keep on fighting. That's what the monument looks like. In conclusion, I'd like to end with the wonderful story. The next story, on 13th of December 2020, when the state of war was declared in Poland. And here we have a demonstration. We organized a demonstration where you can see Eva Maria Ślanska, an activist of the Solidarność, and she prepared 2 banners. One banner reads the original from the 1980s: "Women, do not disturb us because we make the revolution." And she prepared her own banner now, celebration of the death. Old people do not disturb us because men do not disturb us because we make a revolution. Tomorrow is the 11th of November, a symbolic day for Poland. And tomorrow we will celebrate independence, the independent female Polish person. And marches will happen in Poland, and we have to symbolically win back this societal importance.
Ponieważ wiem też od fantastycznego zespołu opiekującego się całym tym naszym spotkaniem.
Please allow me a short summary. We have a team here that really support us, and I heard that we got a lot of questions. So just as a summary, I would definitely like to hear a longer perspective. However, I just want to summarize everything very quickly. So we're 4 women from the same generation, women who fought for solidarity, and we're also women who are going to be here after the transformation. We are going to help set up things in Poland as well as in Germany. And our perspective is that we see a different Polish perspective, but that doesn't mean that we're not interested in Poland. During our conversation today, there were many topics that we could talk about in more depth in further sessions. It's also about the generational shift. Because women are still part of today's protests. We also talked about the struggle, about self-determination, about ownership, and also about being able to tell your own story. And that story should be interlocked with a universal context. And the question about these memories is going to be something that's going to be very important in the future as well. That can be a credo. And we can wonder if this story of citizens is part of this universal narrative. When it comes to fighting this force, that's something we can talk about for a very long time. However, Poland is not an exception because this works everywhere in the United States and everywhere else. So we are part of a big cosmos, and these events are global events. And I think the time has come to say goodbye. Thank you very, very much to the participants today. Thank you very much for everybody that joined in today. I would also like to thank the participants on stage. Thank you very much for being here and for participating. Thank you very much. And of course, our panelists. Thank you very much to the whole team who made all of this possible. You prepped everything very well. Thank you very much to those that organized everything. This was for the exhibition Berlin Global. Thank you very much to all the interpreters as well, who had to do a lot today. We talked about lots of different cultures, It was very, very complicated. So thank you very much. We can have further discussions. And I think we are going to go ahead and do that. I hope we are going to meet again, and I hope we're going to have further discussions talking about human rights and also the role of women and women's rights. Thank you very much from the Humboldt Forum.